Imagine a town nestled beside a sprawling forest, a place where the scent of pine needles hangs heavy in the air. This is where our story begins, a story as tangled as the roots beneath the ancient trees. A tale of unexpected connections, buried secrets, and a single whispered phrase that would change two lives forever. At the heart of it all is Sarah, a single mother with calloused hands and a spirit as resilient as the wildflowers that stubbornly bloom even in the shadiest corners of the woods. She works tirelessly, juggling 2 jobs to provide for her young son, Michael. Life is a constant struggle, a tightrope walk between bills and dreams. But Sarah faces each day with unwavering determination, her love for Michael her guiding star. Little does she know, her ordinary life is about to collide with the extraordinary. The dense woods that border her small town hold a dark secret, a secret buried deep beneath the earth, waiting to be unearthed. This secret involves Richard Harding, a billionaire known for his ruthless business dealings and opulent lifestyle. A man who, against all odds, is about to become inextricably linked to Sarah's fate, all thanks to a walk in the woods. The local news crackled with a story that seemed worlds away from Sarah's humble existence. Richard Harding, the billionaire developer known for his towering skyscrapers and ruthless business tactics, had vanished. The report painted a grim picture. No witnesses, no ransom demands, just an empty limousine abandoned on a deserted road. Foul play was suspected. Sarah usually paid little attention to such stories. Billionaires and their problems felt as distant as the stars. But this time something felt different. The news anchors spoke of Harding's enemies, the countless people he had trampled on his way to the top. They speculated about revenge, about corporate espionage, about a life lived on the edge. A small photograph of Harding flashed across the screen. He was a handsome man, even with the coldness in his eyes. Sarah couldn't shake the image. It felt unsettling, a dark cloud hovering over her already challenging life. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself it was just another news story, but a nagging feeling persisted. The woods, usually a place of solace, now seemed to hold a deeper, more sinister mystery. The disappearance of Richard Harding hung in the air, a silent question mark in the quiet town. Seeking a moment of peace amidst the unsettling news, Sarah decided to take Buster, her loyal golden retriever, for a walk in the woods. Buster, usually bounding with energy, seemed unusually focused, his nose twitching as he led Sarah deeper into the familiar trails. The woods were quieter than usual, the birdsong muted, as if holding its breath. Suddenly, Buster veered off the path, disappearing into a thicket of trees. Sarah called after him, her voice echoing through the stillness. A moment later, Buster reappeared, barking excitedly and pawing at a patch of disturbed earth. The ground looked freshly turned, the leaves scattered haphazardly. At first, Sarah thought it might be an animal burrow, but something felt wrong. There was a strange, unnatural stillness about the spot. As she approached, she noticed something else. A faint, muffled sound, barely audible beneath the rustling leaves. It sounded like a whimper, a gasp. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Buster continued to dig, his barks growing more frantic. Sarah knelt down, her hands trembling, and began to clear away the loose soil. The air grew heavy with a sense of dread. What had Buster found? And why did she feel this overwhelming sense of foreboding? Driven by a mixture of fear and a desperate need to know, Sarah dug frantically, her fingernails scraping against the hard-packed earth. Buster whined and pawed, his anxiety mirroring her own. The faint sound grew louder, more distinct. It was definitely a human voice, weak and desperate. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah's shovel struck something solid. Wood. She brushed away the remaining soil, revealing the outline of a rough-hewn wooden box. Coffin. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was buried alive. With renewed urgency, Sarah wrestled with the heavy lid, her muscles straining. It was wedged tight, but she managed to pry it open just enough to peek inside. The sight that greeted her sent a jolt of horror through her. Inside the cramped space, barely illuminated by the sliver of light, lay a man. His face was pale and gaunt, his clothes torn and dirty. He was unconscious or barely conscious, his chest rising and falling shallowly. Sarah recognized him instantly. It was Richard Harding, the missing billionaire. He was buried alive, and she was the only one who knew. Sarah's mind raced. Richard Harding, the ruthless billionaire, was lying helpless before her. Part of her wanted to call the authorities immediately, to distance herself from this bizarre and dangerous situation. But another part, the part that couldn't ignore a cry for help, took over. Despite her reservations about the wealthy, about the power they wielded and the injustices they often perpetuated, Sarah knew she couldn't leave him there to die. She had to help. With a surge of adrenaline, she heaved the coffin lid open completely and, with considerable effort, managed to pull Richard's limp body out of the cramped space. He was shockingly light, his skin clammy and cold. Sarah checked for a pulse, relieved to find a faint but steady beat. She carefully laid him on the ground, propping his head up with her jacket. He was barely breathing, his face pale and drawn. Sarah knew she needed to act fast. She ran to a nearby stream, soaked her scarf in the cool water, and gently dabbed his forehead. She spoke to him softly, urging him to stay awake, to fight. "Help is coming," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. The nearest hospital was miles away, and she had no cell service. It was just her, Buster, and a billionaire buried alive in the woods. After what seemed like an eternity, Richard stirred. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes filled with confusion and pain. He coughed weakly, his body trembling. "Water," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah quickly offered him the damp scarf, letting him suck the moisture from it. He closed his eyes, savoring the small relief. After a few moments, he opened them again, his gaze focusing on Sarah. He seemed to struggle to comprehend his surroundings, his expression shifting from confusion to fear. Where am I?" he mumbled, his voice still weak. "You're safe now," Sarah replied, trying to sound reassuring, even though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I found you, in the woods." Richard's eyes widened, and a flicker of recognition crossed his face. He tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. He groaned and fell back against her jacket. Then, his eyes darted around, filled with paranoia. He looked at Sarah, a desperate plea in his gaze. He opened his mouth to speak, and in a voice so faint she almost didn't hear it, he whispered, "They know about the fire." Sarah froze, every muscle in her body tensing. The words hit her like a physical blow, stirring up long-buried memories and a chilling sense of recognition. What did he mean, the fire? And why did those words send a shiver down her spine? The world seemed to tilt, the sounds of the forest fading into a distant hum. Suddenly, Sarah was no longer a struggling single mother in the woods. She was a terrified child again, engulfed in flames and choking smoke. 15 years melted away, replaced by the horrifying image of the Maplewood orphanage engulfed in a raging inferno. Sarah had been just a young girl then, one of the many children who called the orphanage home. The fire had been sudden, devastating, claiming the lives of several children and leaving scars that ran deeper than skin. Now, those buried memories resurfaced with brutal clarity. The smell of smoke, the screams of the other children, the overwhelming sense of panic. It all came flooding back. And then, a face emerged from the chaos. A teenage boy, older than the other children, running through the flames, pulling kids to safety. It was Richard Harding. He had been a volunteer at the orphanage, a troubled youth performing community service. Sarah remembered him being strangely quiet, almost brooding, but also surprisingly brave. He had saved several children that night, including her. But even then, something about his actions had seemed off. He had acted like he knew where the fire was going to spread, like he was expecting it. The memory was hazy, distorted by the trauma, but the feeling lingered. Richard Harding was somehow connected to the fire, and now he was whispering about it in the woods. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were starting to fall into place. The memory of Richard's actions during the fire played on repeat in Sarah's mind. He had been a whirlwind of controlled chaos, moving with an almost preternatural awareness of the flames. She remembered him pulling her from her bed, her small hand clutched tightly in his, leading her through the smoke-filled corridors to safety. He had been a hero, but there were other moments, fleeting glimpses that now seemed significant. A strange calmness in his eyes amidst the panic, a knowing look as he navigated the burning building, as if he possessed some secret knowledge. He had seemed almost resigned, as if he had been expecting the fire all along. Other children had whispered about him after the fire, saying he was a strange kid, that he knew more than he let on. But those whispers had been dismissed as the ramblings of traumatized children. Now, those whispers echoed in Sarah's mind, amplified by Richard's cryptic words in the woods. Had he known about the fire beforehand? Had he been involved somehow? The thought was horrifying, almost impossible to comprehend. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and Sarah knew she couldn't ignore it. Richard Harding, her unlikely savior, might also be connected to the tragedy that had shaped her life. The realization sent a chill down her spine, colder than the damp forest air. Who knows about the fire? Sarah asked, her voice trembling slightly. She needed answers, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to hear them. Richard coughed again, his face contorted in pain. He struggled to focus, his eyes darting around as if he expected someone to jump out from behind the trees. He swallowed hard, his throat working convulsively. It wasn't an accident, he rasped, his voice gaining a little strength. The fire, it was arson. Someone wanted the land. They paid someone to set the orphanage on fire. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Arson. She had always believed it was a tragic accident, a faulty wire, a careless mistake. The thought that it had been deliberate, that someone had intentionally set fire to a building full of children, was almost too much to bear. Richard continued, his voice laced with bitterness. I found out years later. After I made my money, I started looking into it. I found evidence, proof. But they found out I was digging, and they tried to stop me. He paused, taking a ragged breath. They buried me alive to silence me. He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading. They know I know, and now, they know you know too. He explains that they buried him alive because he was going to expose them. They? Sarah repeated, her voice barely a whisper. Who are they? Richard closed his eyes, his face etched with exhaustion and fear. Powerful people, people with a lot to lose, people who would do anything to protect their secrets. He struggled to sit up, leaning against a nearby tree for support. They thought they could get away with it, with everything. The fire, the cover-up, everything. He explained that the land where the orphanage had stood was now prime real estate, the site of a luxury resort that had made certain individuals incredibly wealthy. Exposing the truth about the fire would unravel their entire empire, bringing down powerful figures in their community. That's why they tried to kill me, Richard said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. And that's why you're in danger now too. You know too much. Sarah's mind reeled. She had stumbled upon a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of power, a conspiracy that had claimed innocent lives and was now threatening her own. The thought of Michael, her son, filled her with terror. She had to protect him, but how could she possibly fight against such powerful enemies? She was just a single mother, struggling to make ends meet. What chance did she have against people who were willing to bury a billionaire alive? The they he refers to are people who tried to silence him. Sarah stared at Richard, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She still harbored resentment towards his wealth, his privilege, the way he represented a world so far removed from her own struggles. He was a billionaire, a symbol of the very inequalities she fought against every day. And now she was supposed to trust him? To believe his story about arson and powerful conspiracies. But looking into his eyes, she saw something beyond the wealth and the power. She saw fear. Genuine, raw fear. The fear of a man who had stared death in the face and knew that it was coming for him again. And then there was the fire. The memory of the orphanage, the terror, the loss. It was all too real, too vivid. If Richard was telling the truth, then someone had deliberately set that fire, someone had knowingly condemned those children to a horrific death. And that was something Sarah couldn't ignore. She was torn. She hated what Richard represented, but she believed his fear. She also remembered him from the fire at the orphanage. She also felt a responsibility to the children who had died in that fire, to the truth that had been buried for so long. Against her better judgment, a reluctant alliance began to form. She would help him, but she would do it on her own terms. She didn't trust him, not completely, but she knew that together, they might have a chance to uncover the truth and bring the real villains to justice. Her love for the children who died at the orphanage made her want to help. As Sarah and Richard began to tentatively plan their next move, a chilling realization washed over them. They were not alone. The rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, the forest suddenly felt alive with a presence that was both unseen and undeniably menacing. Richard, his senses heightened by the near-death experience, stiffened. He scanned the surrounding trees, his eyes narrowed. "We're being watched," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Sarah felt a prickle of fear crawl down her spine. She looked around, but saw nothing but trees and shadows. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sure," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on a dark patch of woods. "They know we're here. They've been watching us since you found me." Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark silhouette against the fading light. It was impossible to make out any details, but the figure's presence was enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through Sarah's veins. They were no longer just investigating a cold case. They were being hunted. Their pursuer had found them. "We need to go," Sarah said, grabbing Richard's arm. "Now." They knew that they were in danger. They were being watched. Sarah, with her intimate knowledge of the woods, led Richard through the dense undergrowth, away from the watchful eyes of their pursuer. Richard, still weak and disoriented, struggled to keep up, his city shoes ill-suited for the rugged terrain. Buster, sensing the danger, stayed close, his growls a low rumble in his chest. They moved quickly and quietly, weaving through the trees, using the shadows as their allies. Sarah knew the woods like the back of her hand, every twist and turn, every hidden path. She used this knowledge to her advantage, leading Richard to a secluded clearing, a place she had often come to as a child to escape the confines of the orphanage. They paused to catch their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They knew they couldn't stay there for long. It was only a matter of time before their pursuers found them again. "We need to find somewhere safe," Sarah said, her voice filled with urgency. "Somewhere they won't think to look." They needed to find a place where they could regroup, gather their thoughts, and plan their next move. They needed to find a way to expose the truth about the fire before it was too late. The shadowy figure is still watching them from the trees. "There's an old cabin," Sarah said, her voice low, "deep in the woods. My grandfather used to take me there when I was a kid. It's abandoned, but it's sturdy. It's our best bet." Richard nodded, his face grim. "Lead the way." They set off again, their pace quickening. Sarah knew the path to the cabin was treacherous, winding through thick undergrowth and across a rocky stream. It would be a difficult journey, especially for Richard in his weakened state, but they had no choice. As they walked, Sarah tried to piece together what she knew. Richard had said he had found evidence about the arson. Where was it? What did it consist of? The answers to those questions could be their only hope of exposing the truth and clearing their names. "The evidence," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "What is it? Where is it?" Richard hesitated, his face troubled. It's hidden, in a safe place, but I need to get to it. It's the only way we can prove what happened." He is still weak and stumbles a lot, but they keep moving forward. He says that they need to get to it to prove what happened. The shadowy figure is still following them. The old cabin was just as Sarah remembered it. Small, rustic, and filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a far cry from Richard's luxurious penthouse, but it offered them a temporary sanctuary. Richard explained that the evidence was hidden in the ruins of the Maplewood orphanage. He had visited the site several times over the years, carefully documenting his findings and collecting key pieces of information. He had hidden a waterproof container with copies of documents, photographs, and a detailed account of his investigation. "It's risky," Richard said. "Going back there, it's the first place they'll look." "But it's our only chance," Sarah replied. "We need that evidence." They decided to wait until nightfall before venturing back to the orphanage site. In the meantime, they needed to find a way to contact the authorities, to let someone know what was happening. But with no cell service and a shadowy figure lurking in the woods, that was easier said than done. He says he hid the evidence at the ruins of the orphanage. It is risky to go back there. The shadowy figure is getting closer. They need to contact the authorities, but they cannot. Under the cloak of darkness, Sarah and Richard cautiously approached the ruins of the Maplewood orphanage. The once vibrant building was now a skeletal silhouette against the night sky, a haunting reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Richard led Sarah to a specific section of the ruins, a crumbling brick wall that had once been part of the library. He explained that he had hidden the waterproof container behind a loose brick, carefully camouflaged to blend in with the surrounding debris. As Richard reached for the brick, Sarah's senses heightened. She felt a presence, a subtle shift in the air. "We're not alone," she whispered, her hand instinctively reaching for a sturdy branch she had picked up along the way. Richard froze, his eyes darting around. He quickly removed the loose brick and reached behind it, his fingers brushing against something cold and hard. He pulled out the waterproof container, his face etched with relief. But their relief was short-lived. As Richard turned to Sarah, a shadowy figure emerged from the darkness, blocking their path. They had been followed. As they got the container, the shadowy figure appears. The shadowy figure lunged forward, his arm outstretched, his hand reaching for the waterproof container. Sarah reacted instantly, swinging the branch with all her might. The branch connected with the figure's arm, eliciting a grunt of pain. Richard, despite his weakened state, stepped in front of Sarah, shielding her from the attacker. The figure, fueled by rage, lashed out at Richard, knocking him to the ground. Sarah, fueled by adrenaline, charged at the figure, swinging the branch again and again. The figure, surprised by her ferocity, stumbled backward, giving Sarah enough time to grab Richard and pull him to his feet. "Run!" she yelled, grabbing Richard's hand and pulling him away from the ruins. They sprinted through the darkness, their pursuer hot on their heels. The figure was faster than them, stronger than them, and more determined than ever to silence them permanently. They needed to find a way to escape, to outsmart their attacker, to protect the evidence that could expose the truth about the fire. He wants to destroy the evidence and silence them. They need to run. He is trying to hurt them. Sarah knew they couldn't outrun the shadowy figure forever. He was too fast, too strong. They needed to use their wits, to turn the woods into their weapon. Remembering a hidden ravine she used to play in as a child, Sarah veered off the main path, leading Richard towards a steep, overgrown slope. The ravine was deep and narrow, hidden by a thick canopy of trees. It was a dangerous shortcut, but it was their only hope. As they reached the edge of the ravine, Sarah turned to Richard. "Can you do this?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Richard, his face pale and sweat-drenched, nodded grimly. "I have to." Sarah took a deep breath and plunged down the slope, carefully navigating the treacherous terrain. Richard followed close behind, his movements clumsy but determined. The shadowy figure, caught off guard by their sudden change in direction, hesitated at the edge of the ravine. He peered down into the darkness, unsure of what to do. He was not familiar with the woods. Sarah, using her knowledge of the terrain, led Richard through the ravine, using its natural obstacles to slow down their pursuer. She knew that the figure would eventually find a way down, but she hoped to buy them enough time to escape. She outsmarts the shadowy figure using her knowledge of the woods. Halfway through the ravine, Richard stumbled, his weakened legs giving out beneath him. He cried out in pain, his body tumbling forward. Sarah immediately stopped and turned back, reaching out to help him. But as she did, the shadowy figure appeared above them, silhouetted against the moonlight. He had found a way down. Without hesitation, Richard pushed Sarah aside, putting himself between her and the attacker. He knew he was no match for the figure, but he was determined to protect her. The shadowy figure lunged at Richard, knocking him to the ground. Sarah watched in horror as the figure raised his hand, a glint of metal flashing in the moonlight. He had a knife.
No.
Sarah screamed, scrambling forward to help Richard. But before she could reach them, Richard kicked out with his legs, hitting the figure in the stomach. The figure grunted in pain and stumbled backward, giving Sarah enough time to react. She grabbed a large rock and hurled it at the figure, hitting him squarely in the head. The figure collapsed to the ground, unconscious. Richard, despite his pain, protects Sarah. He displays unexpected bravery. He is hurt, but he protected her. The shadowy figure is now unconscious. With the shadowy figure incapacitated, Sarah and Richard made their way back to the cabin, their bodies aching and their minds racing. They needed to get the evidence to the authorities, but they couldn't risk going to the police station. They knew that the powerful figures behind the arson had influence everywhere. Using Richard's satellite phone, they contacted a trusted journalist, someone who had a reputation for uncovering corruption and exposing the truth. They shared their story, providing compelling evidence to back up their claims. The journalist, initially skeptical, soon realized the gravity of the situation. He promised to investigate to bring the truth to light. Within days, the story of the Maplewood Orphanage fire and the conspiracy surrounding it became national news. The evidence that Sarah and Richard had risked their lives to obtain exposed the powerful figure behind the arson. Mayor Thompson, a pillar of the community, a man who had built his empire on lies and deceit. He was a very influential person in the community. He was the one who ordered the arson. The journalist that they called believed them. The arrest of Mayor Thompson sent shockwaves through the community. The town was in disbelief, grappling with the revelation that a man they had trusted and admired was responsible for such a heinous crime. Richard, using his wealth and influence, hired the best lawyers to ensure that Mayor Thompson was brought to justice. He also established a foundation to provide compensation and support to the victims of the Maplewood Orphanage fire and their families. Sarah, deeply moved by Richard's actions, began to see him in a new light. She realized that beneath his billionaire exterior was a man who was genuinely remorseful for the past and committed to making amends. He helped the victims of the fire. The legal battles were long and arduous, but in the end, justice prevailed. Mayor Thompson was convicted of arson and sentenced to life in prison. The victims of the fire finally received the closure and compensation they deserved. Richard's influence helped to make sure that Mayor Thompson was convicted. He was able to use his money to make sure justice was served. He did a good thing for the victims of the fire. He was able to use his money for good. In the aftermath of the trial, Sarah and Richard found themselves drawn together by the shared trauma and triumph they had experienced. The social barriers that had once separated them seemed to dissolve, replaced by a deep sense of mutual respect and understanding. Sarah saw beyond Richard's wealth and power, recognizing his vulnerability, his remorse, and his genuine desire to make a difference. Richard, in turn, admired Sarah's strength, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to justice. They are now friends. They began to spend more time together, talking for hours about their lives, their hopes, and their dreams. They discovered that they had more in common than they had ever imagined. They had a connection. They both remembered the orphanage fire. They found out that they had a lot in common with each other. Their relationship evolved beyond a simple alliance. It was something deeper, something more meaningful. It was a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity, a testament to the power of human connection to overcome even the most formidable obstacles. They were no longer defined by their differences. They are no longer defined by their social differences. They had mutual respect for each other. Richard, recognizing Sarah's unwavering work ethic and her entrepreneurial spirit, wanted to help her achieve her dreams. He knew that she had always wanted to open her own bakery, a place where she could share her love of baking with the community. He offered to provide her with the financial backing she needed to make her dream a reality. Sarah, initially hesitant to accept his generosity, eventually agreed, realizing that it would not only benefit her but also her son, Michael. He wanted to help her achieve her dreams. With Richard's help, Sarah opened Sarah's Sweet Treats, a cozy bakery that quickly became a local favorite. Sarah's delicious pastries and warm hospitality drew customers from far and wide. She was finally able to provide a better life for herself and Michael. Richard also helped Sarah secure a better home, a safe and comfortable place where Michael could thrive. Sarah was finally free from the financial struggles that had plagued her for so long. She was able to live her dream. She was grateful for Richard's help. He helped her and her child. She had a better life because of him. She was able to open her bakery. Years later, Sarah and Richard stood together near the old Maplewood orphanage site, now a memorial garden dedicated to the children who had lost their lives in the fire. They looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were an unlikely pair, a single mother from a humble background and a billionaire from a world of privilege. But they were bound together by a shared experience, a secret that would forever connect them. "I never thought our lives would intertwine like this," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "Neither did I," Richard replied, his gaze fixed on the memorial garden. "But I'm grateful that they did." They acknowledged the unlikely bond forged between them in the woods.